I've talked in earlier presentations of how an Islamic state is developing in the territory of the land that was promised to Abraham, and how this is in fact, in terms of territory, a reformed Assyria. Now, we come to Ezekiel 38, and Ezekiel 38 is describing an invasion of the land of Israel that leads up to the intervention of God in human history in the second coming of Jesus Christ to the earth. If you look in the wider structure of this part of Ezekiel, you've got prophecies about the return of Israel to their land in chapters 36, 37. Then you've got this chapter 38, the invasion by Gog, and then you've got chapter 39, the destruction of that invasion by God's intervention, and then chapter 40 begins the description of the establishment of God's kingdom on the earth. So then, who is this Gog, and what's going on here when you read here in Ezekiel 38 about this invasion? Well, it'll be good to have the chapter open in front of you, because what I want to do first of all is to go through the descriptions of Gog and the invasion and show that they are continually alluding to the Assyrian invasion of Israel and the Assyrian attack upon Jerusalem under Sennacherib. Verse 4, I will turn you around and put hooks into your jaws, will bring you out with all your army, etc. Now, Isaiah 37, verse 29, God says about Assyria, I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back. Same language, I will put a hook in your jaws and your nose, etc. Ezekiel 38, verse 8, after many days you, that is Gog, will be visited by God. Isaiah 10, Isaiah 8, God says that the day of visitation is coming upon Assyria. Verse 9, we're told that this invasion will come like a storm, and it will be like a cloud to cover the land of Israel. That's exactly the language used about Assyria, like a storm to cover the land. Isaiah 10, verse 3, a destroying storm that will arise. This thought will come into Gog's mind in chapter 38, verse 10 of Ezekiel. Same in Isaiah 10, verse 7, that God puts a thought into the mind of the Assyrian. Verse 11 of Ezekiel 38, Gog says, I will go up. Twice he says it, I will go up to attack Israel. Isaiah, about the Assyrian, we're told, he said that I have come up to Jerusalem. He was coming up against Israel, or Judah. Verse 12 of Ezekiel 38, the Gog invasion comes to take spoil and to take wealth. That's exactly what we read of the Assyrian doing so many times in Isaiah, coming up to Judah and to Jerusalem to take spoil and to prey. God says in Isaiah 10 verse 6 about Assyria, I will give him a command to take the spoil and to take the prey. These are the very same Hebrew words used. God talks about how angry he is with Gog in verse 19 of Ezekiel 38. In my anger, in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. And that's exactly the language of God's anger with the Assyrians in Isaiah 30 verse 27, that he speaks burning with anger in the fire of his wrath with them. Then we read verse 22 that God will rain on Gog judgment, an overflowing shower with hailstones, fire, and sulfur. This is exactly Isaiah 29, verse 6, Isaiah 30, verse 30, that God will come upon the Assyrian with the flame of a devouring fire, with blast, storm, hailstones, thunder, earthquake, a great noise, and the flame of a devouring fire. This is exactly what is being said about Gog. There will be a great shaking, verses 19 and 20 of Ezekiel 38, in the land when God does this judgment. Same, Isaiah 29, Isaiah 30, about the judgment of Assyria, that it will come with a great shaking and the towers will fall. God says against Gog, I will magnify myself against you, in verse 23 of Ezekiel 38. And here in Isaiah 10, verse 15, I will magnify myself against Assyria. Finally, chapter 39, verse 10 of Ezekiel, God says, they will plunder those who plundered them. This is Israel. They will plunder those who plundered them and rob those who robbed them. In other words, what was done by Gog to Israel will be done to Gog. And this is exactly what God says about the Assyrians. Isaiah 33, when you have finished destroying, you will be destroyed. Talks a lot in Ezekiel about the way that this invader will have archery, bows and arrows. Ezekiel 39, I will smite your bow out of your left hand and cause your arrows to fall out of your right hand. Look at the bas-reliefs that are done by the Assyrians on their monuments. They portray themselves as posing with their bows and arrows. So it's another allusion, I would say, to the Assyrians. Now, this invasion of Gog in chapter 38, verse 17, we're told that this is the invasion that all the prophets of Israel have spoken about for so long. Now, it can't refer, I therefore suggest, to an invasion by Russia, because there's no other verse that can be, passage that can be sort of put into service to try to prove that idea of Russia invading Israel in the last days. Rather, all the prophets of Israel are repeatedly talking about an invasion of Israel by Babylon and Assyria. And now, in this latter day invasion of Israel before Jesus comes back, the prophet says in 38 verse 17 that this invasion by Gog is the one that was predicted by all the prophets. So it's definitely Babylon stroke Assyria. Ezekiel 38 verse 9, as we saw, says that Gog comes up like a cloud to cover the land. Now that's the Hebrew word shoah, which is the word used in Judaism at the moment to describe the Holocaust in the 1940s. And this word is used here, and it's used also of the Assyrian invasion in Isaiah 10 verse 3. That's a pretty scary thought, that there will be another worse Holocaust, as it were, worse than what happened at the time of the invasion by the Assyrians, worse than the Shoah, the Holocaust brought about by Nazi Germany. As Daniel says, this will be a time of trouble for Israel such as never was, and that, of course, includes what was done by the Nazis in the 1940s, what was done by the Assyrians, the Romans, etc. So don't think that Israel is going to, as it were, survive and the IDF are going to somehow win all the battles. No, in the end, Zechariah says, Jerusalem shall fall, it shall be taken. The city will go into captivity, the women will be taken and raped, and the spoil shall be gathered in the midst of it. Let's think a little bit more about Gog being manipulated with hooks in his jaws. Now, people can get very scared about what's going on in the Middle East and the Islamic State and all this kind of thing, but let's take a bit of comfort that actually it's all under God's control. This is God manipulating, leading the nations. And it's alluding to how the Assyrians used to present themselves and their steles and their art forms as taking their captives into captivity with hooks in their noses, in their mouths, on their jaws. You don't even have to look at art to see that. 2 Chronicles 33:11, we're told that the kings of Assyria took Manasseh captive in hooks, that they put hooks in his jaws. So then, what's being said here, I think, when God says, I'm going to do this to Gog, God is saying, as you led people into captivity, including my people Israel, so I will do to you. And you think, wait a minute, isn't that Revelation 13? The beast who leads into captivity shall be led into captivity? Sure, it's the same idea. So then, Gog is the beast. He's the one riding the beast, as it were, leading the beast, this individual. And there's a number of indications, as we look at in our presentation on the Antichrist, that there is one specific individual who will lead this latter-day invasion. Now, Gog, as I've said, is a personal name. Gog is a person, not a nation. He is the Rosh, or the prince, or the Caliph, as Muslims would say, of these nations around Israel who will come with him to invade Israel. Now, there's only one person who the Hebrew Bible actually calls Gog elsewhere, the word occurs in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, but there's only actually one guy called Gog in the Hebrew Masoretic text. And you can read about him in 1 Chronicles 5. And Gog was an Israelite, an apostate one, who drifted into Assyria, lost his faith in his God, and assimilated into the Assyrian Empire and lived, we're told, on the banks of the Euphrates. Now that's on the very edge, the northern boundary of the land promised to Abraham. So then the biblical Gog alludes to him, that he's a kind of a false Jew who comes from the ends of the Eretz, of the earth, the land promised to Abraham. And in Ezekiel 38 verse 15, we're told that Gog comes from his homeland in the uttermost parts of the north. Now, what do we mean by the uttermost parts of the north? It's too simplistic to say, yeah, well, if you go north of Israel, you come to Russia. Well, actually, you don't come to Russia straight away. You come to various other countries, to Syria, Turkey, and so forth, and Ukraine, and then, only then, you come to Russia. And if you're going to take this literally, as talking about north in terms of the whole planet, well, the uttermost parts of the north wouldn't just be Russia, it actually would be the Arctic. And I want to suggest that this is not the way to look at it. Apart from that, the Earth is a globe, right? It's a sphere. It's not flat. And the uttermost parts of the north, what does that mean in terms of a sphere? If you look at a football or something and say, well, where's the north point on this? Well, it depends what angle you look at it from, doesn't it? We're so used to this projection of the planet on maps, etc., that we tend to think, oh yeah, well that's to the north. I want to suggest that the key to Bible prophecy and understanding it is correctly understanding what is the earth or the land that is spoken of. The Hebrew word eretz can mean the whole planet, that is true. But it can also, and very frequently, refer to the land that was promised to Abraham, from the Euphrates down to the river of Egypt. That is the eretz, that is the land, and that's why when you read about the nations being gathered from the four corners of the earth, well, a sphere doesn't have corners, right? The idea of coming from the extreme northern border, or from nations coming from the four corners of the earth, this can't apply to a sphere. This must apply to a specific and defined and well-known and understood territory. And the eretz, the land, the earth, which the Bible knows, is the land promised to Abraham, which is clearly defined. And the Euphrates is several times used in the Bible to define that northern border. So then when Gog is described as coming from his homeland in the uttermost parts of the north, well, that's where the biblical Gog of 1 Chronicles 5 lived. And you could say that his origin will be somewhere along the Euphrates River, on the northern border, on the very northern border of the land promised to Abraham. And that is the area that is right now under the control of the Islamic State. I did another presentation about the significance of the Euphrates River and how these guys have taken the towns along the Euphrates River. And it's no accident, I don't think, that al-Baghdadi, that's the caliph, the leader of the Islamic State, was born in a little town along the Euphrates River, from the uttermost sides of the north, the uttermost border of the north, if you're talking about the Eretz as the land promised to Abraham. Now, the usage of this term Gog, as I say, alluding back to the Gog of 1 Chronicles 5, would suggest then that this invasion is by a false Jew, a fake Israel, as it were. And that idea is continued when you look at the text of Ezekiel 38 in more detail. We're told, for example, that these invaders are a great company. That's said 4 times in Ezekiel 38, verses 4, 7, 13 and 15. But when you look at that Hebrew phrase, a great company, it's nearly always used about the congregation of Israel. Gog is the chief prince. And that Hebrew term is only used elsewhere about the chief princes of the tribes of Israel. The invaders, verse 8 of 38, come to a land, that is Israel. And that little phrase, come to a land, this is used time and again of how Israel were to come to a land, the land of Canaan. So then these invaders are being set up, especially to people reading the Hebrew text and picking up the allusions. These invaders are being set up as a fake Israel. Now, that's actually what Islam is, because the Quran twists right round the whole story of Ishmael and Isaac, puts it the other way round, that the Jews are the rejected ones and Ishmael are the accepted ones. And that's the whole basis of Islam's hatred of the entity known as Israel and the Jewish people. That you were rejected, you were Ishmael. It was Isaac who was cast out into the wilderness and was not the true seed of Abraham. The true seed of Abraham, they say, was Ishmael. They say the Jews switched that round in the Bible. But what's happened is the Quran is the one that switched all that round. So then they feel, the Islamists feel, and the Muslim faith claims that they are the true Israel, and that Israel are the rejected ones of the seed of Abraham, that is the people known as Jews today. And so it's not surprising then that this latter-day invasion is described in terms of a false Israel, of people who act and see themselves as the true Israel of God when they are not. And just in passing, that's why when you read about the beast in Revelation, it's full of allusion to Israel. I mean, the whole 666 business, the only other time you read about 666, that's the number of talents of gold that came to Solomon, king of Israel, in 1 year. That's in passing. Now, there are other references to Gog in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, the Greek translation of the Old Testament does differ in a number of ways to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. But what's significant is when you look in the New Testament at how the inspired New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, they nearly always quote from the Septuagint and not from the Masoretic or the Hebrew text. Now, I just throw that out for you to think about, but don't rubbish the Septuagint like that. It must have some relevance. There are times when New Testament writers have a choice of how they quote, because when there's a verse they're quoting that differs, when it's the one thing in the Hebrew text, another thing in the Septuagint, they tend, not every time, but they tend to quote the Septuagint. Just throw that out for you to think about. When you come to the Septuagint, you read about Haman, of course the persecutor of God's people at the time of Esther. In the English Bible it says the Agagite, the man of Gog. The Gog person is how the Septuagint translates that. And that's, I think, confirmed because 3 times in the book of Esther you read about the wicked device or the wicked plot that Haman hatched to destroy all the Jews within the land promised to Abraham. And that very same Hebrew phrase occurs here in Ezekiel 38 verse 10, that Gog thinks up an evil plan, a wicked device to invade Israel. And there's another point in the Septuagint where you read about Gog. It's totally different to how it is in the Hebrew text, but it's in Amos 7 verse 1. Thus as the Lord God showed me, and behold, a swarm of locusts coming from the east, and behold, one caterpillar, King Gog. King Gog, he comes from the east. Now, that's exactly where Babylon and Assyria were located, from Jerusalem, from Israel, but of course they're described as coming from the north, because there's a huge desert between, let's say, Jerusalem and Babylon or Assyria, and they, to get their armies to attack Israel, they would go up the Fertile Crescent and then down from the north. So the king of the north, the enemies from the north, yes, they attacked from the north, but actually they'd come from the east. Now, if Gog is a person, and he's called in Amos 7 verse 1 in the Septuagint, King Gog, well, that would make more sense, that he is the king who comes from the east. He's an individual, not an army. Now, of course, talking about locusts, you think of Revelation 9 verses 3 and 7, where the locusts come to attack God's people in the last days with thousands of horsemen coming from the Euphrates. And Isaiah 33 verse 4 calls the Assyrians locusts. So you've got it pretty well tied up, I think, that Gog connects with the leader of the Assyrians. Now, in Sirach 48 verse 17, that is an apocryphal book in the Jewish Apocrypha, you actually got that stated in so many words, that the leader of the Assyrian invasion is described there as Gog. I said that the invaders of Israel came down from the north. Although they originated to the east because they couldn't cross the desert, they went up by the Fertile Crescent along the fertile area along the Euphrates and Tigris, and then they came down from the north through Bashan. Bashan. You remember Og, king of Bashan, that you read about in Deuteronomy 3 and Deuteronomy 4? Well, in the Septuagint, it's not Og, king of Bashan, it's Gog, king of Bashan. So I throw that into the mix as well. Now, this great invasion that we read of here in Ezekiel 38 talks about a great and huge company of horsemen. These guys are horsemen. Picking up Revelation 9 again, the locusts coming from the Euphrates, and I've said that they are alluding to the Assyrians. Well, we read of 200 million horsemen coming from the Euphrates. It's exactly where the Islamic State are operating right now. And they kill a third part of the people of God in his land. So then, these horsemen that you read about, this huge company of horsemen in Revelation 9, this surely is alluding, I would say, in terms of ideas, maybe not specific similarities of language, but of words, as it were, but certainly the allusion is to the idea of the huge horse invasion of Israel that Ezekiel 38 speaks about. And the culture of the jihadist movement is full of allusion to history. If you look at the videos that the Islamic State are putting up on YouTube, there's so many pictures of horsemen. They present themselves as the latter-day jihadist horsemen with their black flags on their horses coming to invade Israel. Now, Jerusalem at the time of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem was compassed with armies, was surrounded by armies, and that's exactly the language the Lord Jesus uses in the Olivet prophecy to say that in the last days Jerusalem again will be surrounded by armies. So then, the fact that we're seeing a reformed Assyria in the form of the Islamic State, with all these nations gathering together, these peoples, tribesmen, etc., they're all gathering together under one umbrella. And yet, of course, they're totally divided against each other. And Ezekiel 38 says that, and 39 says that these people will come to their end by turning their swords upon each other, which is how Israel's enemies historically have normally come to their end. Rather than necessarily God having to kill them all, they kill themselves. And that is an allusion to Ishmael and what was said about him, that his hand will be against every other man, and his brethren will be against him, and his own descendants would all be against each other. So it's very much locating all this talk about a great invasion in terms of the nations who were known in the land promised to Abraham. Now, let's just zoom out a little bit from Ezekiel 38 and look at Ezekiel as a book. And it's a series of prophecies that are, as it were, tied up in different sections. And from Ezekiel 33, verse 21, up to the end of chapter 39, that's all one section with 6 prophecies in it. If you look at Ezekiel 33, 21 and 22, I understand that to mean that Ezekiel gave these 6 prophecies that are in the section that I've said from 33:21 up to the end of 39. He gave them the night before the exiles received the news that Jerusalem had fallen to the Babylonians, because Ezekiel was in captivity in Babylon. So the night before, the 5th day of the 10th month of the 12th year of the exile, the night before the news came that Jerusalem had fallen, all through that night, Ezekiel was giving these prophecies from chapter 33:21 up to the end of 39. And I think what he's doing, he's preparing the Jews in captivity for the news that was going to come the next day, that Jerusalem has fallen to the Babylonians. And I think what he's saying is that, look, this is going to happen again. What's happened, this is just a prelude, this is a foretaste, a prototype of another huger fall of Jerusalem that will happen in the last days, but the good news is that it will herald the final victory of God against Israel's enemies and the establishment of God's kingdom. So he was trying to give the people some comfort that night for what was going to be told them in the morning, that Jerusalem had fallen. And he's telling them that, yeah, look, it is bad news for us, and bad news for our guys back there, but, you know what, this is only a prototype of what shall happen in the future. Yes, we are sinful, it's happened because of our sin, and it's going to happen again because of our sin, but there is light on the horizon, in that this is a prototype of what shall happen in the last days. So I would say then that the various nations listed in Ezekiel 38 would have been known to the exiles in Babylon who were hearing the message. And the picture would have been, oh yeah, these are the guys who are with Babylon. Now, of course, the question is, why does he talk about Gog, and why doesn't he spell it out and say this is Babylon alluding to Assyria, or Assyria alluding to Babylon, or whatever? Well, I would say that he uses Gog as a code name for all these nations that are under the leadership of this one man, Gog, because Ezekiel was in captivity in Babylon, and it could have got him into trouble to actually state it in so many words. There's something similar in 1 Peter 5:13, where Peter talks about the church that's in Babylon. He doesn't mean Babylon, he's actually talking about Rome, but he's using a code name, and actually there's quite a few times in the Bible where that appears to be done, in sensitivity to persecution issues that were going on at the time, and that sort of use of code names carries on in a lot of the missionary work and pastoral work that we do with Muslim converts to Christ in places like Iran, Afghanistan, right up to this day. Now, you've got the repeat of Gog and Magog in Revelation, have you not? Where again you read about Gog and Magog, and they're kind of paralleled with all the nations that are from the 4 corners of the earth. And I've said that doesn't make any sense if you're thinking in terms of the globe. It must refer to a defined territory. Now, I suggest that is the land promised to Abraham. We're going to talk about this later, but I would go with Harry Whittaker's suggestion that this invasion is actually when the millennial reign of Christ is established, and not at the end of it. So then, Gog and Magog in Revelation come with the kings of the earth, the kings of the land. And actually that same phrase is used here in Ezekiel 38, that these people who are to be destroyed, who come with Gog, are the kings of the earth, the leaders within the land promised to Abraham. Now, of course, we want to know, don't we, who these guys